I'm Lynn Tomaszewski. I'm the Dean of Academic Affairs here at Cranbrook. And thank you all for coming out tonight. Tonight is the first lecture in our Academy-wide lecture series. And we are thrilled to have Risa Puleo join us tonight and talk about her curatorial practice. So I'm going to introduce her. But first, let me thank, this lecture series is supported through the generosity of the Gilbert Family Foundation, so we want to thank them for their generous support of this. And now, without further ado, I'll introduce Risa. Risa Puleo is an independent curator. She is one of a team of curators who organized the 2023 Counterpublic Triennial in St. Louis. I had the good fortune to hear about the Counterpublic Triennial a couple of weeks ago from the director of it, James McAnally. And it's really an amazing, ambitious, embedded exhibition within the city of St. Louis. So I can't wait to hear Risa's perspective on this. Risa's exhibition, Walls Turned Sideways, Artists Confront the American Justice System, was curated for the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston in 2018 and traveled to the Tufts University Art Gallery in 2020. Monarchs, Brown and Native Artists in the Path of the Butterfly was curated for the Bemis Center for Contemporary Art during her year as curator in residence and traveled to the Museum of Contemporary Art, North Miami, Blue Star Art Space, and Southwest School of Art in San Antonio, and the Nerman Art Museum in Overland Park, Kansas. Other exhibitions have been hosted by the Henry Art Gallery in Seattle, Art Pace, San Antonio, the Leslie Lohman Museum in New York City, Franklin Street Works in Stamford, Connecticut, Charlotte Street Foundation in Kansas City, and more. Puleo has master's degrees from the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College and Hunter College, and is a doctoral candidate in Northwestern University's Art History program. She has written for Art in America, Art Papers, Art 21, Asia Art Pacific, Hypoallergic, Modern Painters, and other art publications. So please help me welcome Risa Puleo tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. And thank you so much to Emmy, Bryant, and Cooper, and Print Media, all the students who opened up their studios and their hearts and minds to me over my past couple days here. I also wanted to briefly acknowledge Gaza and the continued heaviness that holds our hearts and minds there, especially as tonight I'm going to speak about the continued occupation of native land in the United States. So I ask how we can all consider using our collective voices to call for a ceasefire and safe access to water, electricity, food, and medical supplies in Gaza, and the safe passage of humanitarian aid across all borders. All right, so tonight I'm going to be talking about my contribution to Counterpublic, a triennial which took place between April and July of this year in St. Louis. And I was part of a curatorial team, an ensemble, that included my colleagues below. And something that's maybe different about Counterpublics is that we were all invited to contribute individual curatorial statements. We worked together, but we didn't necessarily collaborate on who we were inviting into St. Louis to make commissions. So I'm going to give you a really long explanation about how I came to make certain curatorial decisions. And hopefully this will also be a little bit of an introduction to me as a curator, but also to a longer history that St. Louis and Detroit are a part of. So I'll get into that. So my curatorial practice proceeds through a series of exhibition-generated inquiries. One show begets a set of questions that result in the next show and the next questions. So the of my questions for St. Louis actually developed from these two shows, Monarchs, Brown, and Native Artists in the Path of the Butterfly, and Walls Turned Sideways. I made these shows in really close succession, and there was something kind of bothering me that I was lingering on about something that was unwritten between the two of them. And that became a realization that if we're going to talk about the abolition of the prison system itself cannot be abolished until we abolish the nation settler state. In this case, the United States, for which the prison acts as an extension of. So until the nation state is abolished, then there will be abolition. In St. Louis, it's a city that was built as the gateway to the West. Okay, we'll come back to that. St. Louis is known as the gateway to the West. This means that dispossessing armies moved through the city to the West to dispossess and remove through genocide all the native populations west of St. Louis. It also served as a passage to the north, or if we can think about it in a different direction, the edge of the South for fugitive slaves. So within these conversations between decolonization and abolition, they sometimes miss each other. So my contribution aimed to issue a corrective to how these abolitionist movements and decolonial projects have historically missed each other. So for Counterpublics, I built on Walter Johnson's assertion in A Broken Heart of America that the eviction of Black communities from St. Louis City to the outlying St. Louis County, where Ferguson, Missouri lives, operates by the same mechanisms that dispossess the Osage, Fox, Sauk, and other native people ancestrally belonging to the region. So to look through St. Louis's, quote, gateway to the West through an abolitionist framework is to see occupation as a method of capture, settler colonialism as maintaining the borders of containment, and the nation state as a state of carcerality. This logic begat questions. And for myself, those questions for my exhibition were, how do you make a public art exhibition that does not restage an occupation? How can that exhibition also evade the many surveillance systems that police St. Louis's Black communities? And this is actually, I think, another thing that makes Counterpublic a different kind of triennial is that they aim to make interventions into the city structure towards lasting change. So how do you contribute materially to changing the city? So my answers to these questions took the form of an exhibition that was materially made of sound, plants, dirt, clay, bees, memories, light, and water. These elements constitute the land and were summoned in an attempt to make apparent the traces of carcerality and coloniality written into St. Louis's urban spaces in order to understand the city's vacancy and eviction in new ways. So I'm going to get deeper into these histories as I show you a couple of projects that I curated into the show. We'll talk about the history of native dispossession, the leveling of native main architecture, the mounds. We'll also talk about the St. Louis City relationship to the St. Louis County, where Ferguson is. I'm showing you here, this is a map of the exhibition space. It took place along Jefferson Avenue, which is one of the longest streets in St. Louis. It's 6 miles long, and it ended on one hand on Sugarloaf Mound, and then on the other hand at Griot Art Museum of Black History. So on one hand, a trio of museums dedicated to Black life in St. Louis, and then on the other, Sugarloaf Mound, one of the last remaining mounds in St. Louis. As I talk about all of these different things, I'm also going to give you a very brief history of roughly 10,000 years and 300 mounds that are no longer in the greater St. Louis area. And I'm going to interject artworks throughout the way. But first, I had an encounter with a bird during the pandemic. And these questions, this is the personal side, these questions about how do you make an exhibition that is evasive of surveillance and doesn't restage an occupation was inspired by this bird who does this. So this is a violet green sparrow in Colorado, and you'll notice that he's the same color as the rock, and his green is the same color as the river, but when he flips backwards and shows you his white like belly, in this moment of vulnerability, he's presenting himself to you. So the idea was to make this exhibition that would kind of hide out of sight, but then would choose to show itself to you if you were also attuned to be presented to. I forgot about him. Okay. So this postcard tricks us to thinking that St. Louis is easy to see. That if we got in a position that was high enough above, we could understand it, know it, navigate it, potentially own it. When it's, in fact, surveillance images like this that helped control the city and the populations that were being policed. Images like this are constructed in a way that hides the shape of the land that the city is built on and the histories that are contained within that land. And this postcard also contains a double irony. First, no mounds are featured in an image of the city that proclaims itself Mound City. And second, the postcard was printed on the same day, and that is November 8th, 1868, that the demolition of Big Mound began. Big Mound stood 34 feet tall and only miles away from the Gateway Arch. And in this way, this postcard, commemorates an identity that is not actually pictured in the image. And not only that, an identity that was actively being erased in the construction of the city. So here's St. Louis. I got a pointer. Actually, St. Louis City is actually really small. And then all of this is all St. Louis County. So Jefferson Avenue cuts through this kind of central downtown area that is the city proper. So the shape of St. Louis and its sprawl have been determined by the migratory patterns of humans engaged in turbulent flights, each moving according to their own rhythms and vectors. Since it was established as a city in 1764, people have moved through and into St. Louis propelled by their own power, and also have used that power to force others to stand still, move elsewhere, or else to flee to, through, or from the city. Forced relocation, westward expansion, the Underground Railroad, the Great Migration, white flight, and the dispersals caused by property blighting are some of the many patterns of movement made by people in St. Louis. We know the contours and crevices of these histories of colonization, slavery, dispossession, displacement, disablement, expropriation, and exploitation, but less visible are the ways that these are etched into the city itself. Because these flights happen on the ground instead of the sky, they leave conceptual and material traces in the earth when imposed ideologies reshape the land into a human vision for the settled world. Tonight, I hope to be bringing some visibility to those things that have been erased. So I'm showing you a slide that I use when I teach my Native American art history class. I teach ancient through contemporary indigenous arts of the Americas. So that's all time across 2 continents. Because that's how art history is organized. So within the field of art history, there's no such thing as a, quote, medieval period of American art because of the ways in which the discipline is built and also organized according to European definitions. Methods that assume this sort of blank slate or terra nullius logic of settler colonialism by insisting that the Americas were largely unowned and unoccupied, thus justifying the right to make claim and the potential to make property. So mound building cultures began as early as 8,000 BC in Poverty Point. This is northern Louisiana. And that was a city that hosted 5,000 people. It is the largest and oldest city in North America at its height between 1700 and 1100 BC. There are basically three types of mounds. There are effigy mounds. If you've ever been to Iowa, maybe you've also been to Serpent Mound in Ohio. It's about 4 hours from here. These are mounds that are in the shape of animals, and they were sites of gathering for people. Other mounds, like Cahokia, which here is enormous, these were seats of governance. This is like a huge platform for projecting to a large group of people. And then in the far side, we have the Hopewell Mounds, also not far from here, about in northern Ohio. These are burial mounds. So ancestral remains, people also buried alongside things they might need on their journey to the other world. Now, these mound building cultures appear throughout the Mississippi River Basin, which is here highlighted in green. You can see that it extends from the Dakotas down to the tip of Louisiana, all the way up to New Jersey, western New York, and everywhere that the Mississippi River has a tribute. And of course, some of those tributes of the Mississippi are rivers in themselves, like the Missouri. And St. Louis exists at the confluence of the Missouri and the Mississippi. This means, where's my Detroit one? This means that Detroit was actually in the area of a mound building culture. And there has been some articles, if you're interested. This is, from what I can tell, the majority of mounds are things that might be confused for hills, things that you may not necessarily kind of acknowledge as an architecture by a sort of Western standard of what an architecture is. And then on the left is a map of where a lot of those mounds were located, because they are also have been leveled in the process of making a city like Detroit. So I wanted to show you this because when St. Louis was called Cahokia, it was the heart of a vast trade network that was supported by the Mississippi River. So we're talking about here. You can see how all of these rivers kind of meet in Cahokia. That means that all of these waterways also brought people up to this place to trade. So from the on-the-ground perspective of those who followed rivers, to walk to Cahokia was to descend slowly down slanting earth. You can see here's this elevation of how we're essentially this river valley is created by these Appalachian Mountains on one side and then the Continental Divide on the other. And so your kind of water flows downstream, kind of following this land as it kind of gets more shallow. So you're walking down the rivers, slowly down slanting earth. Tributary, no, I lost my place. So Cahokia was Cahokia, we know it now as a mound, but it was an entire civilization, was the largest single mound complex in this entire cultural sphere, and it is located across the river from where St. Louis currently stands. It would have had a platform mound at the center of it, and that would have been occupied as a seat of governance for a population of nearly 20,000 people at its height between 700 and 1400. That main mound is called Monk's Mound, and it was surrounded by about 120 smaller mounds. For reasons that are unknown, perhaps famine or illness, Cahokia was abandoned by the time that colonial forces encountered it in the 16th century. So this is Cahokia now. Nope, that's not it. This is Cahokia now. It's a national monument, and it is cut in half from the other mounds by a road system and highways that run through and around it, dividing individual sites. So it's so this interconnected river system also that meant that materials follow the people to all the places that they traveled. Thus, we find shells for marine animals that were only found in the Atlantic at Cahokia. There's materials that came like mica and galena from different parts of the world, what we call the United States today. Flint from the Flint River made its way across the nation as you see this massive interaction of people across this culture. The same watery matrix brought the French to the region, which they renamed St. Louis in 1764. That's when they appropriated the waterways as a mechanism that enabled the fur trade. And it's this appropriation of the river system that is the starting point for Jean Quick-to-See-Smith's painting in Counterpublics. Jean asks us to look beyond the flattened map of the United States to reimagine the terrain of the land, and I'll return to her painting in a moment. After French settlement, it was only a matter of decades before the French sold their false claims along the Mississippi and Missouri as part of the 1803. This map changes. So this is a map of how the frontier is changing over a couple centuries. The Mississippi River transfers St. Louis from native land, then to French territory, into the United States proper. And the United States would double again in size in 1848. That's when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo incorporated everything to the west of St. Louis, which was then Mexico, into the United States. And these shifting boundaries of the United States in the early 19th century moved St. Louis from the frontier of the country to its center, where it took on a central role in the dispossession of the West. St. Louis is a place from which the majority of U.S. soldiers were deployed to wage wars of native genocide and dispossession, thus paving the way for settlers who believed that occupation was their God-granted right. So just as Big Mound and others that were just as large as Cahokia, inside St. Louis City's limits proper, were dismantled, literally, to pave the roads and railways that the soldiers and settlers would follow west. Big Mound was at the northernmost of a group of 27 mounds in East St. Louis. And again, smaller mounds in this group were actually built atop caves. So they have this relationship as like kind of building up the land above a recess in the land. We're going to watch. Here's the cluster group. Here's some caves. And here's the dismantling of Big Mound. Here is a monument that stands commemorating it. So St. Louis is also the place where manifest destiny was conceptualized as a natural, divinely appointed progress of the white race into the West. A microcosm of these logic and the wars of dispossession is written into the city streets. We're looking at a map of the Benton Park neighborhood. Benton Park is bounded on the north by Arsenal Street, so named because it led to the U.S. Army's stores of munitions. Before the Civil War, St. Louis was the site from which all soldiers, as I've mentioned, in the wars of removal from 1826 to 1865 were deployed. After that war, westward expansion became a shared goal of the Union and the Confederacy. So St. Louis became the headquarters of the Army's Department of the West, which a site which politically divided soldiers, Black, white, Confederate, Union, could reunite under the common cause of genocide. On their war hunts, soldiers often blazed paths for settlers en route to California and Oregon and the Southwest. And given that history, it's appropriate that this neighborhood is named for Thomas Hart Benton, the Missouri senator and proto-Christian nationalist who drove this westward expansion through the city. Under Benton, sooner or later, they must all go policies, native peoples in all directions surrounding St. Louis were moved to reservation lands in Oklahoma and Kansas. So many of the streets surrounding Benton Park, the neighborhood, it's up here at the top, sorry, right here, were named for native tribes. So if you're looking at east-west streets, you see the names Cherokee, Winnebago, Chippewa, Miami, Osage, and more of the people who had been actively removed from St. Louis. All the north streets are named for US states. And the result of this naming system and spatial logic is the symbolic impasse of Native people and the forces of dispossession at every intersection in a microcosm of Indian removal across the United States. So here we have, Winnebago people are the ancestral people of Wisconsin, Miami from Illinois, Osage from Missouri, I can't read, Chippewa or Ojibwe from Minnesota, and throughout this, there's more kind of intersections like this throughout the neighborhood. So this brings us back to Jean. I installed this painting at the center of the State Street neighborhood. And for 30 years, Jean has, in her incredible brilliance, has shown us different ways in which state names, state boundaries intersect and override Native lives in an insistence of Native, Indigenous ways of being in place. So as her painting here shows us, many of the street names written on the signage in this street are appropriations of Native place names. And they're names that were used by Native people who lived in those regions to describe the land. So words like Missouri and Nebraska conjure images of the muddy or flat rivers that move through these places. In the state names, we also find allies, Dakota, or friends, Texas, Native people who traded with each other and later settlers. In the word Wisconsin, we see that flash of the bird wing, of the holes in the banks of a river in which birds nest. Jean's paintings aided visitors in navigating the State Street neighborhoods through these Native descriptions of place. And then I, in an homage to Jean, used the format of the exhibition label to readapt the street signs by bringing forward some of the meanings and histories hidden within them. I should also tell you, this project has been long delayed, and that is because bureaucracy is real. And this is not to, I want to be perfectly clear that it is a project that the city is committed to, so it's not one of censorship or anything like that. It's just due diligence. So Counterpublic is also making an appeal that these be permanent installations in the city. So getting back to one of the goals of Counterpublic, how do you make material changes in the city itself? I think that the delay of these street signs within the bureaucratic process of the city is in itself an effective method. I've paused a set of conversations, interjected new information, and now hopefully will arise like a series of conversations about how that neighborhood has been named, to what purposes now, and to what effects. And now when these streets signs go into the street itself, there's maybe more opportunity for conversations about how people interact or think about the histories of the places that they have so casually never been told. So this is one of these sort of material civic interventions that Counterpublic kind of aims for. So the movement of soldiers and settlers from St. Louis who pushed Native people out of their ancestral homelands here and elsewhere were also concurrent with the movement of enslaved people, fugitives and freemen to and through St. Louis. With its redefined borders, so St. Louis was no longer the edge of the West, it was now the center of a country. And it also became the place where the North and the South met the West, making it ground zero for 19th century manifestations of both settler colonialism and emancipation movements. So remember again that topography of the river basin, which draws all its waters going lower and lower as it spills into the below sea level city of New Orleans into the Gulf of Mexico. Topographically, that means that fugitives who also followed the Mississippi River from St. Louis in their flight from slavery walked on increasingly higher ground as they approached the north. So Missouri's historically contentious relationship with slavery includes the Dred Scott case, which challenged the legitimacy of institutions within the Free State. Scott's appeal for freedom was denied, and despite being defended by an attorney with ties to the Free Soil Party, the Free Soil Party was headquartered in St. Louis, and it was an abolitionist political party that fought for the West to be a slavery-free zone where African Americans could also participate in the dispossession of Native people in a settler-defined notion of freedom. Thus, at the intersection of these coeval histories is a paradox that lies at the core of American rhetorics of freedom, as it has been historically defined since 1776. That is, the movement into states of freedom is an opportunity to participate in the capture and containment of others, an absorption into the violent occupation of the settled nation state. So analyses of policing practices and the continued assault on Black men across the United States demonstrate the various degrees by which freedom as a concept has been unequally applied and distributed. The contemporary prison abolition movement historically has tied itself to histories of laws of Jim Crow, which makes it primarily an abolition of the South. But the South is only one aspect of St. Louis's geographic identity, an identity built through reorienting the land into mapped representations of the settled nation. An abolition of the South at its intersection with the West instead contends with the space in which abolitionist movements and decolonial and unsettling practices have historically missed each other. Okay, we're going into Mound History Part 3. I wanted to talk for a moment about Benton Park and a project by Raven Chacon, who just won the MacArthur Genius Award. So going back to this idea of Benton Park and thinking about the ways in which these historical racisms have operated through surveillance and visual regimes of power. We chose Benton Park as the site for 2 performances by Raven. We're looking at documentation for one. It's called Music for 13 Paths. And in this performance, Raven reconfigured the scale of the musical octave. If any of you are musicians, you know the octave has 12 notes to define it. This is an arbitrary Western system that has also been imposed on different civilizations across the world. Raven instead took that same space of the octave and divided it into 13 chimes and hand-tuned these 13 chimes to his new reorganized system. We then found 13 volunteers, all of whom took one chime through a different path of the city to Benton Park. And on the way, encouraged visitors to follow. So I think what's also really beautiful about this work, and then another performance that Raven did in St. Louis called Drum Grid, is that he's encouraging finding each other through sound and forming communities through other ways that are not visual. So bypassing the ways in which surveillance works to build solidarities and togetherness in other ways. Once they got to the tallest hill in the top of Benton Park, which I just want to pause and say is a settler mound, all across St. Louis there's this deliberate attempt to level all the mounds, but then there was this other competing attempt to make these 19th century landscape ideals of a rolling English landscape. So this is a settler mound that's made out of landfill. And so you oftentimes have maybe the remnant of a native built architecture across from a mound that itself is made of landfill and is maybe a highway entrance ramp. So on top of the tallest mound, The participants in the performance then had to find their way into using sound, touch, leaving sight behind as much as possible, found a way to reorganize the chimes back into their unit, and then together place them atop the mound in this kind of, you can't really see it here, but it was this kind of like counter arch, or this like kind of ghost arch of the St. Louis Gateway Arch. Okay. So the next mound I want to talk about today are the 16 burial mounds that once stood in what is now Forest Park. Here's one of the few images left of these mounds before they were dismantled for the 1903 World's Fair. And they were dismantled to construct the fairgrounds. Just as dismantling the big mound provided the literal material to build paths west, the destruction of the Forest Park mounds enabled the building of institutions which provided St. Louis and its cultural identity as an American city. So here's Forest Park. So World's Fairs were opportunities to build institutions like museums and to fill those museums with collections of objects acquired in various ways. So in St. Louis and other places, the dismantling of mounds were central to filling these new museums with objects. The 1903 St. Louis World's Fair commemorated the Louisiana Purchase 100 years earlier and followed a very well-established World's Fair model. For example, the Chicago World's Fair, which commemorated Columbus's arrival 400 years later, initiated an archaeological program to dismantle those Hopewell mounds in Ohio for their artifacts. Like those mounds at Forest Park, the Hopewell mounds were burial mounds. Archaeologists worked to unearth the ancestors buried there and distributed their bodies to anthropological museums like the Smithsonian, who collected them in mass and then distributed them to smaller museums across the country. These excavations would also unearth artifacts. These are the Hopewell micas, which were found in the Hopewell mounds and then now live in the Chicago Field Museum, which is the product of the Chicago World's Fair. These local historical objects would be joined at World's Fair exhibitions with other cultural objects collected from other excavations across the globe, instrumentalizing the exhibition as a site for redistributing objects around the world's occupied spaces, into a microcosm of the museum. So people from these occupied spaces would also be put on display in the ethnographic section of the fair and their objects, including in some cases entire villages of people along with their houses and all of the things in it. And it's also particularly notable in St. Louis that many of the native people who were put on display were the very same tribes who had been recently dispossessed in the West by soldiers and settlers from St. Louis, or who themselves, like the Pawnee, had been dispossessed of their lands in Missouri. So while Native people were no longer legally able to call St. Louis their home, they could be forcibly put on display as ethnographic curiosities. Among the groups of people on display were a group of Filipino people who were pushed into spiritual abuse through forces that required them to perform ceremonies for audiences multiple times a day for months during the long duration of the exhibition. Also notable, a notable figure from this moment is a man from the Congo named Otabenga, who after his time in St. Louis was transferred to the Bronx Zoo. I am not showing you a display of those people because I also don't want to replicate the violence of showing their bodies or recreate the spectacle around their lives. This is a primary method of mine. I came of age in the 90s under an era of BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and these methods of withdrawal, of refusal, and not wanting to replicate have become central methods to the way I work. And then I think also help inform questions about like, how do you create an exhibition that doesn't redo this as a primary starting point? When we're talking about a public art exhibition, when we're thinking about what traditionally occupies the space of public art, we think about monumental sculpture, big sort of spectacular gestures. So then to think about an exhibition that is working through trace, that is conjuring spaces of absence so that we may see absence, is a very different sort of tack. Here's Coco Fusco and Guillermo Gomez Pena. We're going to show them instead of ethnographic displays of people. If you're familiar with this work or not, they are thinking, or were thinking about this history deeply at the 500th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the United States. This is in 1993, when there's certainly a different politic around this. Okay. This is Cahokia. This is Big Mound. No, is it? I can't. Yeah. This is where Big Mound was. And we're going to go here next. This is Sugarloaf, and it's the last mound I'll be talking about. So it's thought that Sugarloaf was a signal mound because it would have been visible. No. Okay. Because it would have been, like if you had a fire, that fire would have been visible from here or here. And so then it could have been this like sort of communication device between these larger groups of, larger distances. But we can't be sure of this. This postcard shows us how Sugarloaf Mound also functioned as a wayfinding tool for settlers in the city, marking divisions between what are now neighborhoods. Sugarloaf survives because somebody built a house on it. They built that house in 1923, and in that moment, they subdivided what is one big mound into 3 private properties. Nope. Okay, we're going to stay here for a while. Like Cahokia, Sugarloaf is a platform mound. We are looking at it from an image above it, and you can see a platform mound means that there was an apex, and then it came down to another platform and another platform. So a house was built on the top, second platform, another house was built on that. A kind of community apartment building was built on that third level. It is occupied by a fraternity of pharmacists. And then on the fourth level, which would have been like a kind of big expanse that led to the river, that's now owned by the Missouri Department of Transportation. I need to look at this. There's a house. This is an image of Sugarloaf. You can see that one of those houses there cut into the side of the mound. This is from the family scrapbook of Joan Heckelberg, whose family lives on that second tier and has lived there for 2 generations. All right. Oh, so we've been talking about these native architectures that have been erased in the history of the city, but I also wanted to pause and talk about other architectures that have gotten leveled. We are looking at Mill Creek Valley. It was an entire neighborhood of primarily Black people that lived in the city and built a thriving culture. This is the area of town that like Josephine Baker is from historically. So in 1959, Mill Creek Valley was wholesale leveled. And all of the residents there moved into Pruitt-Igoe, one of actually the largest public housing complex in the entire world. This is also known as the place where modernism died, because it is this sort of epic failure of the sort of Bauhaus idea of like communal living push to ghettoization, and also built on toxic land. So Pruitt-Igoe had a long history of very intense cancers in the community. Pruitt-Igoe was demolished and leveled in 1972. We are looking at the remnants of the doll houses. These were multi-level single-family homes within an affluent Black neighborhood, which through property blighting, it became the value of the home became less than the value of the materials themselves. So this also instituted a practice called brick eating, where abandoned houses would be burned to loosen up bricks, and those bricks would be sold downriver to build neo-plantation style homes in New Orleans, Lafayette, Baton Rouge, and the Caribbean. And we're also tracing in this the movement of one group of people from one neighborhood that's now destroyed, from Mill Creek Valley to Pruitt-Igoe to the upper outer banks of St. Louis City into St. Louis County, leading us to Ferguson. Okay, so I want to go back to those doll houses. Bricks from these brick-eaten buildings were sold to the wealthy residents of other cities downstream. Jackie Sumell is an artist based in New Orleans, and her work entwines prison abolition with plant justice. And she endeavored to return some of these bricks to St. Louis in a 3-part material intervention into the city's history. One aspect of Sumell's project was a private ceremony in which she found St. Louis bricks in New Orleans, crushed them. This is also like sacrilegious. There are brick collectors who would have flipped out about this. So she crushed these bricks first into ground clay, and then mixed those brick remnants with dirt and soil from the Mississippi River, and then also seeds from native plants, and then took them back to the quarries where some of those bricks had been unearthed from the ground. So we talked about this as an act of brick rematriation. We also didn't disclose where these kind of dirt, clay, would have been returned in protection of those sites. But then also returning dirt to dirt would have also been a sort of imperceptible action. This process then became a community gathering point. Jackie hosted her own free soil party, and this play on words of that historical political party. And in this sort of reparative gesture to the imperfections of a historical abolitionist movement, she found that the mixing of the soil with the seeds was to talk about this sort of mutual displacement. The plants that grew from these soils were infused into an alcohol that then was also served at the free soil party. It was called a liberatory libation. Okay, so we're looking at the backside of Sugarloaf right here. So this is this really important moment in its history. In 2009, the Osage Nation purchased the house that was built on Sugarloaf, and thus they purchased Sugarloaf Mound. And in doing so, they reinstated Sugarloaf's status as a sacred site. They protected it with a fence, and if you could see that fence, it would have a sign saying that if you walked beyond it, you would then be trespassing onto the Osage Nation. In recognition of how Sugarloaf has now been removed from the confines of the nation state through the very methods of property that constitute it. In addition to these overt actions, the Osage Nation also initiated a series of undoings, including dismantling the house and reabsorbing the mound into the nation, thereby expanding Osage territory back to their ancestral homelands. In the place where the houses stood, plants that would be considered weeds elsewhere now grow tall. So in weighing the various possibilities for integrating art into this site, withdraw from acting was the only option for me to engage it. To add to Sugarloaf would be a form of artistic trespass that negates the mounds as an entity in their own right. Other gestures would decorate it, turn it into a tourist destination, tell histories that weren't for any one person to tell or share. What can be communicated in words and materials doesn't always intersect with what should be communicated. Instead, Sugarloaf and a few other sites that I'm not going to talk about were actually removed from a list of possible artistic additions within the exhibition, and then they were allowed to live with their own terms. So instead of invite an artist to do anything on Sugarloaf, I invited an Osage artist, Anita Fields, who invited her son, Ngozi, to collaborate with her on the project that we're looking at. This project is called Way Back. I should pause to say she invited Ngozi and her daughter, Welena, to collaborate with her. And it's built on the land next to Sugarloaf. That is land that was previously used as a quarry, meaning that it can no longer be built on. It's unsteady. Clay and earth were removed from the site by settlers to construct bricks, like the ones that Jackie was using in her project. So when you're walking through these different platforms, you have opportunity to look at how each of their tops is embellished from patterns that reference Osage ribbon work. Patterns themselves that reflect Osage philosophies about sky, water, and earth. Ngozi Fields is a musician and sound artist, and so his sound piece emanated from below the platforms, reflecting the philosophies that were imparted by the elements in the composition and interweaving wind instruments with field recordings. The platforms are modeled after those that are found at Osage events in displaced territories in Oklahoma. There, they're recognized as designated spaces to gather, relax, talk, sleep, and prepare for celebrations. In St. Louis, 40 platforms hold space for people to gather in relation and proximity to Sugarloaf and consider the earth from which the mound was constructed, the sky that unfolds above the platforms, and the sound of the Mississippi River on the banks below the quarry, as well as the wind that flows through the surrounding trees that are transformed first into breath and then into music and the sound composition. I also want to mention this was like a hawk and vulture hunting ground. So every time I went out there, they were always fishing around the Mississippi and it kind of like swarm. It was really awesome. This is still from Wallena Field's performance. She organized a theatrical play about Osage worldviews told through these incredibly beautiful oversized puppets. So what do we mean when we talk about return? We're looking at a billboard by my they were curators. New Red Order functioned as a curatorial capacity and then also contributed a billboard and a video to the show. This billboard was above Sugarloaf Mound for the 3 occupants that lived on other parts of the mound. They would see this as they were leaving Sugarloaf anytime that they needed to leave their house. So the same plants that grow tall on Sugarloaf act as a reclamation of the mound as an extension of the Osage Nation on their native lands from their displaced territories in Oklahoma. Marketed as neighborhood beautifications in the name of ecological restorations, rewilding projects prompt questions about the term restoration itself. Restored to what? When and for whom? Who is restored in the process? Attempts to purchase the other 3 parts of Sugarloaf Mounds have all been thwarted by greed and supremacy. The frat house that lives on that 3rd section of the mound is reported to have said that the Osage offered them beads and trinkets when they were displeased with how much they were offered. I think they offered asking price. And when the Missouri Department of Transportation received an offer to sell a piece of land that was for sale, they tripled the price. I can come back to these, but I feel like I'm going a little long. So this is a project by Chanupa Hanska-Luger. It's an augmented reality project that you can actually access through Instagram. And here is an intervention at the bluffs below Sugarloaf Mound where X, an artist based in Chicago of Coshada descent, so Chanupa, X, Jean, and Anita are all artists who had historical ties to St. Louis via those rivers. The Chanupa and X are from places that are connected to St. Louis by these rivers. Jean spoke about how St. Louis was important to her because it's how the French got to Montana. They started in St. Louis and moved upwards. So this was an attempt by X to return the Mississippi to the bluff. It's currently separated by a 1/4 mile of industry, And so he's doing this with a light and sound installation that approximates moonlight as it's bouncing off the water onto the stone wall in a wave pattern. And for Chanupa, who I believe is talking here soon, he was thinking about what it would mean to return the buffalo to St. Louis. So this is a performative action that invites the buffalo to come back. And if we're thinking about what return looks like for the buffalo, then we would actually need the Mississippi to return to the edge to feed those plants that it has been disconnected from, to give water to animals, to have that industry taken away as a barrier. So my work to bridge decolonial and abolitionist thinking has necessitated a turn to the ecological, to understand the ways that the land itself and human and non-human animals and plants who live upon it and within it are all entangled in the same struggles. The Mississippi River itself is imprisoned by a series of locks and dams, undercut by pipelines and diverted to create levees that house shopping complexes. As an imprisoned space, to attend to these different struggles, we need a marriage of decolonial, abolitionist, and ecological approaches. So I'm showing you here, and I'm going to end on this. This is what the Mississippi River looked like before all of those locks and dams were in place. And I'm going to go here. This is actually just that one portion of the river that's in that tiny square. And we're going to go here to show you that on the left, this is how the Mississippi, if it didn't have all of these kinds of literally pins in place to hold it, would jump wildly based on what its needs were. And that makes it really inconvenient for settlement and industry. If you're trying to harness the river as a way to move between places and it's jumping and holding too much water, then it's maybe, if you want to contain it, literally lock it in place and prevent it from moving, you get something that looks more like this. Each one of these markers is a place where there is a dam. And that's not including all the levees. This is not including all of the shopping complexes, all of the housing that are built along this way to keep it contained. I think I'm going to end there. We can come back to this. I feel like that might be an inconclusive ending, but I'm really looking forward to your questions. Hi, Yasmin.
I'll project.
Thank you so much for that. So incredibly informative. This might be a little of a selfish question because it's something that I don't know how to navigate, and I'm curious as to how you navigate it. I think a lot about how coloniality is so pervasive in the way we communicate and the knowledge we have about land in general. And I used to, when I was in Canada, I used to introduce myself. I'm a settler from Takaranto. And that was common knowledge and everyone knew where that was. And then when I came here, I started doing the same thing and people were like, where? And then I had to be like, oh, it's colonial known as Toronto. And that moment, even though there was the addition of colonial known as, I'm still acknowledging that it's called Toronto-ish. How do you navigate that, this lack of knowledge about land names, and the names are so important, and the fact that in many ways they're lost by a lot of folks who don't know better? How do you navigate still decolonizing your language and decolonizing the land and the architecture that you live in, but also wanting to communicate?
So I think one thing that I want to point out about your question is that you're talking about how Canada has different methods and protocols for repairing, acknowledging at the very least, its role in dispossessing Native people and the violence it's enacted. And I believe that Canada is also issued a series of apologies, or maybe at least one.
Bad ones.
Bad apologies. There's also maybe different programs in place, and certainly at a different place than the United States is in acknowledging its
Totally.
colonial past, which I think Biden said something once. It's 2023. So Canada, for whatever that means, is in a different place than the United States in the wide-scale acknowledgement. I think there's also, so that's one part of a response to your question. I think the way that I used to respond was really intense feelings of anger. I think we all may have felt these kinds of feelings before in conversations. And something that I think is maybe the thing I put on blast and repeat over and over and over in my teaching when I teach. I teach at the School of the Art Institute. I teach Native American art history, ancient to contemporary, all across the indigenous Americas of all time and place. And I also teach classes on like art and justice and like what do we mean when we want to talk about the prison and the museum and kinds of questions. And so this is the thing that I repeat the most. You can't be an abolitionist if you're acting like a disciplinarian. So that is actually something that really requires us to have an embodied presence in the face of things that are upsetting. To, I think, also know what my position is. To also be open to listening, which doesn't mean that I'm open to changing, but maybe, I don't know, maybe. But it also means prioritizing kindness. And also maybe understanding that everybody is at a different place in their learning. That as somebody from a place slightly more progressive than the United States, like Canada, you maybe have a set of privileged experiences to a kind of discourse that others from an incredibly rural place may not have had, that's the first time that they're thinking about something. And always trying to keep an open mind about like, we're all in a space of learning and becoming and undoing and grappling and challenging. And I think it also means being able to like hold other people's anger and not be swayed by it too. Does that answer your question?
Thank you so much for that. There's so many things I want to ask you, but I'll save most of them for later. I've just respected your work for so long in terms of how you navigate opacity and what should be seen by whom. So thank you for the bird as a metaphor or a guiding post, I guess. But I want to ask you a question about visibility, I guess, that maybe dovetails with your question, because I'm interested in the curatorial methodology. And yeah, I think I could ask you about so many of the artist's works and like what an artist project can do versus what a curatorial intervention can do. But I'm thinking about, and like maybe it's because we've also like curated in the same space where there was a land recognition left that
I wrote it.
Yes.
No, I didn't. My intern helped.
Well, you worked.
Wrote, yeah.
So a little bit is about.
We're talking about Bemis. Sorry.
Yeah, with monarchs and how you worked. You didn't just write it, but you worked with others to write it, as I understood, as you told me. But I'm curious about these erased history landmarkers that were the curatorial text in the process for making them potentially permanent. And I'm wanting to bring this up because I'm thinking about a couple of weeks ago, I went on a walking tour of Black Bottom. And some folks might know Baba Jaman Jordan, who does the Black Scroll tours, which I really suggest that you do them in Detroit if you haven't done them. And someone might know better than me. I think he's actually like maybe the official historian of the city now. But he's been doing these kind of radical history tours for a long time. And he was in the middle of like, and so you might know a little bit about the history of Black Bottom and displacement there, the Mies van der Rohe development, the urban renewal. So I think now they're building a surface road, and they had stopped the tour at a marker that is now a marker about the abbreviated history of Black Bottom. And a friend who's like an informal historian walked by who has lived in that neighborhood since he was young. And he remarked on how he wasn't giving the full history about Gilbert's role and what is happening in the development now. So Gilbert, who funded your talk. I'm thinking this against Vera List Center in New York just did an event about global Black and Indigenous solidarities and rethinking beyond the frameworks of the US. And a lot of it, like, they had done their normal land recognition in the beginning of the talk, but then they also spoke about how people were indigenous to different places globally, and that this was a contemporary conversation. And one of the artists pushed back and said, you know, you're acting like you're referencing the land and not the people, and you're acting like they're in the past. So in terms of like how you wrote these histories, the one you showed was very much about the past. But yeah, how you as someone, you know, the ethic of the parachute and curator, and I think this ethic of leaving an infrastructure, this ethic of like what you can do in that space and time is something I know you think deeply about. So maybe you can share a little bit about that process. And yeah.
Yeah, I should also mention that there's a larger sort of material change attempting to be made in St. Louis, which is to rematriate all of Sugarloaf Mound. This is work that the organization is doing in collaboration with New Red Order, who has one enormous aspect of their practice is the Give It Back movement. So there are other kinds of material changes. That one is a really big one that I forgot to mention. So just want to pause on that and say, back to your question more directly, that the text that I showed you was vetted by the Osage. And there's also just like shitty logistics. How much words can you fit on a sign? I hope that it says that there are Osage people that still live in St. Louis or that live in Oklahoma. I think that it does. So like, I think that there were questions also about like, what can you fit on a sign? What is important about this sign to communicate in 150 words and what is possible? So where the Osage Nation continues to be based. And then, I don't know, I'd be interested to talk to you more about whether you think it's effective or not to then invite contemporary Osage artists to test like as a commitment to the continued presence of Osage in the community. And that is a live, present, experiential versus something that's moved into a sign. I think there's also sorts of questions about what like constitutes or what is a igniter of change in a community. And so when I hear like the sort of critique that was experienced as part of this like Detroit walking tour, that's an immediate kind of change that could be made. Hey, you forgot this. Maybe in a non-disciplinarian tone, in an abolitionist way. How can we make this better? How can we how can we represent people more accurately or as living as part of the fabric of this community? I think that there's also different kinds of changes and different kinds of scales of change that are enacted in counterpublics. I think pushback, please, quote, success of this, if it ever goes up, would be that it ignites conversations that maybe lead to more conversations that maybe over time lead to questions about like how these cities got named and why we continue to live in these places that like index violence so latently and so casually. That's a long series of conversations. And I think that like we also have we want instant gratification a long time. And I think we're also like some people culture is enamored with the sort of like idea of like a quick revolutionary change that is inherited from maybe like union rhetorics or like Marxist discourse about like how like if you push hard enough you can force something, and then we're like within a disciplinary framework. Did that answer your question? No.
Yeah, and I think it's a continuing conversation, and I think I will highlight that Baba Jaman, who did the tour, I don't think he solely wrote the new plaque, but yeah, it was this idea. I think there's something in your presentation and your work where you're you're alternating between opacity and trace and like, you know, the underbelly and showing the belly to who needs to see it, but also like this is visible. People need to see this. And I think in the walking tour, it was like, you know, within a position in government, you can only do so much.
Let's take it.
And what you're saying about increment, and I think there's a lot of change that, you know, you and I both try to do with accessibility, where it's like, you know, there's certain things that can be done in the space of an artwork or something outside of an institution that's different in an institution. So yeah,
I think that is also really important. You're making me think about like work in Walls Turn Sideways. So Walls Turn Sideways is an exhibition which I worked with artists who were like really putting stress points. They're all artists who are working with incarcerated people within the institution of the prison, and then finding like the stress point and pushing at it and see how far it can be pushed. Some walls are made of iron. Some walls are imaginary. Some walls you can move through, flip sideways, turn upside down. And this is why I love this Angela Davis quote as the title for that show. The complete quote is "Walls Turn Sideways Are Bridges," Angela Davis's biography. This idea that like art is also this imaginary, or like offers a platform for the imaginary, where you can think about what it might mean for a wall to turn sideways. And then if maybe I'm just a boundary pusher too, therapy, like where just like push it and like see, and then you'll come up to a wall eventually, or you won't, but we got to try it.
You said something in answering Taranay's question about what can an artist project do versus a curator project do, and I'm interested in that, and more particularly being here at this particular school. I feel like we love to use our hands, we love to make a thing. Not everyone, and I'm interested in how you showed I might say her name wrong, the one quick to see.
Jean Quick to See.
Oh,
Yeah.
Jean Quick to See Smith's paintings versus these other projects, and I'm wondering if there are different things that a made object that would be sort of occupying a space versus these more ephemeral, trace-based and like material change projects. Like, how do you see works like this operating in terms of the what can an artist project do?
Mm-hmm. So I just want to pause to say Jean is one of my heroes. This was a really big moment to get to work with her. Incredibly brilliant, incredibly gracious, such a model for living and working in like so many different ways. And I would also say, like, I feel like at the core of your question, correct me, is this other one this sort of statement that we make about art all the time, and art's ability to change us, change the world. And these are like also kind of inherited avant-gardist ideas about like artists being at the sort of forefront of movement, and that they're opening up different ways of us to see the world. Do we believe this anymore? Maybe. We say it often enough, right? And I think that something that Counterpublics is interested in doing, certainly New Red Order, something that I have been trying and articulating as a goal in my work for a couple of exhibitions at least, is like, what if that's not a metaphor? What if it's not an internal state that this change is happening? I think your question is like, how does an object living in a traditional art space kind of contend with the kinds of material change of an artist using their leveraging power to return a mound to a native community, or material change in the fabric of it, like a sign like that would be. I also contend that like spending time with this object, this is going back to something that I think also Yasmin was saying, is offering us a completely different epistemological framework for interacting with the world. And that we are asked to rethink how we understand space, not through borders and highways and streets, but through rivers, which are taking over like the sort of priority. And what if we thought about the river as a sort of primary driver of geography? Then we're already kind of back in this sort of mindset of a Mississippian culture, or sort of thinking about the prairie and thinking about the holistic of the river to the sort of other animals that are pictured in the painting as well. So that's it's a conceptual change that maybe could only be asked through an object. I don't know how a activation could do that other than me telling you.
No, that's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, and that she creates the space for you to sit in that contemplation. Yeah. Thank you.